something to eat, and now we feel refreshed. That we are feeling refreshed and looking forward to this afternoon. So welcome to yet another exciting moment of deeper conversations and deeper listening and deeper linking with each other. This afternoon, we are privileged to have our listeners with us, and indeed, they have been with us since morning. They have shared in our conversations since this morning. They are now going to help us reflect even deeper what we heard this morning by reflecting back to us what they have had. May I have this opportunity now, the pleasure of inviting Ms. Teresa Albano. And when I met with Teresa just over lunchtime, I thought this was very interesting. I was meant to introduce Teresa, but then she told me something. Why should you introduce me when I'm here? I can introduce myself. So that was very interesting. Thank you. So I will invite Ms. Teresa to introduce herself and her team. Welcome, Teresa. Yeah. And now I hand over. We will sit behind. Yeah.
You should allow me to, sorry. First of all, welcome to everybody. Can you hear me? Yes. I would welcome everybody is following us online. This is an open section of our assembly. And yes, we receive a present from Teresa. She's coming from Samarkand and brought us this beautiful plate for the 10th anniversary of Talitha Kum. Thank you, Teresa. Teresa drafted the project that brought to the establishment of Talitha Kum in 2003, I think, because we started in 2004. So 2002 or 2003. So she's taking care, and she's an expert in migration and trafficking also. And I'm very happy and glad that she is in charge for this very important table, and you will introduce us. Thank you.
Voilà. Yeah. Ouais. Alors, je vais essayer de modérer cette session.
So I will facilitate the session in French, and I'll do my best. Because for a long time I didn't speak French, but I'll do my best to speak in French and to facilitate this session. Allow me first to introduce myself. I work for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is, the headquarters are in Vienna. And we in particular are in charge of social and economic inequalities. In my portfolio, I'm in charge of governance, of migration, and in particular of women and young people, the empowerment of young people and women. This morning, extensively, we've been hearing about inequalities between men and women, as well as imbalances, economic imbalances. I would like now to introduce the afternoon panelists. The aim is to basically focus on the keywords, which somehow are the keywords we have heard in your contributions from this morning. And I would like to, first of all, introduce each of the panelists, and each panel will have a 10-minute presentation followed by comments by the other panelists, and then we will have an open debate and exchange of views, so you can ask questions, make comments. To my right, it's not really my right, it's my left-hand side, it's your right. Mrs. Maria Grazia Gianmarinaro. She is the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Trafficking, particularly women and minors. She's also judge in the civil court. She's been a special representative on human trafficking at the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, and she's also been representative at the EU, and her most recent report is Innovative and
the inclusion of survivors of trafficking into societies.
It is a report on social and economic inclusion of victims of human trafficking. I also have the pleasure to introduce Carlos Andres Perez. He is an official of the UN Office against drugs and organized crime, in particular working in prevention of organized crime and judicial crime. He's been in Bogota, living there and working there for the last 10 years. He's been coordinator of the national project on human trafficking, and currently he's in charge of coordinating UNODC activities in Latin America. You're probably aware that the UN agency fighting against drugs and organized crime is the so-called custodian, promoting the protocol on human trafficking of the United Nations. I also would like to introduce Mrs. Angela Reid. She's from Australia. She's sister of Mercy, coordinating the Mercy Global Action, which is a bit the legal and judicial arm of the Mercy International Association. She has a doctorate, a PhD, achieved on vulnerabilities, which is titled Exploiting Vulnerabilities. Her background, she's an educator and a social worker, and currently she is the main representative of Mercy International at the UN in New York. Now finally to my right, and this is correct this time, I have Helen Okoro. She's an educator. She's working for the time being at St. Joseph's Institute. She's an educator, and St. Joseph, it's a community welcoming people in vulnerabilities, so single mothers, orphan children, migrants in vulnerable situations, and victims of human trafficking. She's going to give us a bit she's going to bring the voice of those who are suffering these vulnerabilities.
And right now, j'ai fait mon effort.
I did my effort, so now allow me to go back to English, which is, I hope later to speak again in French. So I'll have a bit of switches.
We are going to cluster our conversation into three main axes as the questions were clustered during your working groups. So the first conversation will be focused on vulnerability. And we are going to have one main speaker out of the panelists here. Then the other panelists are going to give further comments, and then we are going to open to questions from the floor. So, vulnerability. I read also the report from the working groups, and I selected some keywords on which I would like Angela to help us to reflect more in depth. So I will launch a couple of words just to refresh our conversation of this morning. Corruption, conflict, gender inequality, socio-economic inequality, widespread violence, dysfunctional families. So these are few of the words that are contained in the reports of your working groups. Now I will ask Angela to reflect on these words, to comment, and to offer us additional perspectives. Angela, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. It's been a great privilege. I've actually, as many of you know, I've been here since we began. And unfortunately, I need to leave at the end of today. But I'm most grateful to have been part of, for a few days, this wonderful gathering. And I'm very proud to be a sister and part of Talitha Com. So yes, thank you, Teresa. I've been asked to respond to the situations of vulnerability and the issue of prevention. And I'll try, conscious of interpreters, I'll try to not move too fast. So the question was, what are the situations, conditions that have put people in vulnerable situations and facilitate trafficking? From the outset, I want to acknowledge that my work with survivors has largely been in the Australia and Southeast Asia region, with a particular focus on the Philippines. And it's vitally important to make clear from the start that many of you are working in diverse and very different social and political contexts. And this, of course, has an impact on the way you perceive and respond to human trafficking. Likewise, as we know, there are numerous manifestations of the human trafficking phenomenon. Many of you, as expressed, work with women who've been sexually exploited and or trafficked as domestic workers. Likewise, you've encountered other forms of trafficking, such as those caught in labour trafficking, sweatshop labour, or even the fishing industry. And some of you may have encountered victims of organ trafficking and indeed forced marriage. What is significant in all these scenarios is that traffickers exploit vulnerability, in many instances deceiving those who have placed great trust in them. You named some of these vulnerabilities, including poverty, organised crime, family violence, the dream of a better life, sexual exploitation. Someone in the room asked, who are those using the vulnerable? We need to address demand. And I totally agree that the issue of demand is one we must continue to remain steadfast in attending to. And I think also we must address supply. It's really quite crass to talk about people in terms of demand and supply, but that's the reality. The world economic system prioritises profit over people. And so we're faced with what someone once described as an oversupply of impoverished women and a whole lot of cashed up entrepreneurs looking to spend their money in whatever fashion they like. It's true that poverty is a huge vulnerability factor. But I was challenged when I was working in the Philippines by a survivor who said, You know, sister, there are plenty of people who live in poverty, but not all are trafficked. And this encouraged me to dig deeper and to question other factors, some of which you have mentioned, most of which you have mentioned today. The whole issue of patriarchy, sexual violence, colonialism, and racism are some of the root causes of human trafficking. An Australian political scientist by the name of Carol Barchi talks about the idea of, and I think this is a made-up word, so it might be difficult for the interpreters, but she talks about the idea of problematization. She says, how we define the problem determines how we think about its solutions. So how do we understand the problem of human trafficking, and how do we get to the root causes? In my research on trafficking, I discovered 6 main lenses through which people describe the causal factors of trafficking. Number 1, organised crime. The very, very common lens through which people look at the issue of human trafficking. 2, globalisation. And we talked about how easy it is to be in touch with someone on the other side of the world with the flick of a switch. 3, economics. 4, migration. Many of you talk about migration as an overarching issue to do with trafficking. But one caution, sometimes governments use migration as a reason, use trafficking as a reason to, for border control. So using that lens can have its difficulties. Of course, gender. We know that gender subordination plays a huge part in the sexual exploitation of women. And this is a huge lens through which many religious women have been looking at the issue. And then, of course, there's this local manifestation in which trafficking occurs. In the Philippines, we see things like colonisation and military bases as part of the causal links to human trafficking. But I guess my point is that these varying paradigms suggest that vulnerability to trafficking is made up of a complex set of factors. As you know, it's not simple. We can't simplify the phenomenon of trafficking. It's complex. And so finding solutions will be complex. We have to recognise that some of the vulnerability is the interplay between the macro factors and the micro factors or individual story. Many of you who I've met here work on a daily basis with victim survivors of human trafficking. And I'm sure you can attest to the fact that there is a tendency of society and perhaps governments to pathologise, make the victim the problem, to say that they are the one that has the problem and that somehow they're responsible for their situation. But survivors tell us a different story. And for those of you who know my work, you will know that I will always say that we need to listen to the survivors. And you're the ones who are working with survivors and victims of trafficking. You know their stories better than anyone. Governments tend to benefit from talking about traffickers in terms of catching the big bad wolf. But as human lawyer and trafficking expert Anne Gallagher says, who is the big bad wolf? I think some of the major challenges we face is to identify the problem and reframe the narrative from one in which we understand trafficking, or the common narrative is that it's a random act of victimisation, to understanding it and recognising it as systemic and long-term cumulative disadvantage over one's life. Traffickers will always prey on vulnerability. But in addition to addressing and prosecuting traffickers, we have to address the root causes, the vulnerability. And I think Gabriella, in her openings talk, and others have named two very clear issues that need our attention. And that is the rejection of neoliberalism, which posits profit over people, and the issue of patriarchy, which endorses male privilege and power. Of course, as a network, we seek to address other vulnerabilities, such as lack of education, rural isolation, and poverty. But we must also engage in problem questioning, not problem solving, but problem questioning. In other words, who does this representation of the problem benefit? Who does it silence? Who is considered to be the problem? It's these and many other questions that we must continue to ask. And to conclude, someone said to me over lunch that the church is in a moral crisis. Human trafficking is indeed a moral issue that we as church can respond to, and indeed are called to respond to as the body of Christ. Thank you.
Sorry, it takes a bit. Thank you, Angela. Thank you very much. Indeed, there are individual factors of vulnerabilities that refer to the life stories, the life trajectory of each individual. But there are also structural factors of vulnerability. And I do thank you for also underlining those structural factors that bring a sort of reification of human beings. So human beings are a commodity at the end of the day, like a pair of shoes, in a world where everything has a price, where you can purchase everything, including an individual. But there are also other structural factors, and like the question that you posed, we need to know in order to understand the problem, in order to also craft laws, in order to challenge and to identify solutions. Law is part of the solution or is part of the problem. As far as migration is concerned, laws are very often part of the problem. The more restrictive policies on migration are developed, the more migrants will find a way outside legal channel of migration. And this is one of the vulnerability factors that put individuals in a difficult situation. I would like to invite others here on the table to comment on the reflections of Angela. Sorry, it's a bit, yes. And maybe we can start from you, Carlos, if you don't mind. It's not too considering that the trafficking protocol has been developed within the negotiations guided by the Unodc, and that next year the protocol is the birthdays protocol, 20 years. So how is Unodc dealing with vulnerability factors?
Okay, I will do it in Spanish.
So first of all, thank you very much. In the UN agency against drugs and organized crime, in particular being called to speak about vulnerability, because we are going to look into the activity and the work which has been achieved by our agency, and as well as the challenge that is for states to strengthen legal instruments. Now, one of the initiatives which have been adopted within the United Nations is precisely what do we mean by vulnerability? The same word. And I believe that this morning, when you discussed among yourselves in your language groups, I was with the Latin American group, and we were trying to properly identify in which cases vulnerability could lead to exploitation. Sorry, but the voice is coming and going. The fact that not always vulnerabilities exist in many regions of the world, and one of the main factors to understand the is because the voice is coming and going occurrence. When the voice comes and goes, could you just tell, yes, because of the half word, I can hear half word, but not was the whole word.
Okay, ¿está mejor así?
Yes, thank you. What I was saying is that we were discussing about abuse in a situation of vulnerability. So when do vulnerabilities somehow lead to exploiting a human being? And I would like to invite you to read one of the technical documents which have been drafted and prepared by our office agency, which is abusing in a situation of vulnerability. So a migrant who is in a situation of vulnerability, who is moving, traveling from one country to the other, there is an organized crime network which comes in and takes to advantage of, to exploit the migrant. And so this is one of the ideas around when we speak about vulnerability.
Thank you, Carlos. If you remember the very complex definition of trafficking, which is contained in the protocol, the abuse of vulnerability is one of the forms of deception of let's say, binding the free willingness of the persons that fall prey of the traffickers' network. I would like now to also invite Maria Grazia Giammarinaro to comment on vulnerability. I remember that at the time then when she was special rapporteur, is it better? Special rapporteur at the OSCE, the theme of vulnerability was very dear to you, Maria Grazia. And I remember that one of the things that you were offering as a source of reflection was the process of normalization of exploitation of individuals. If we get used to the exploitation of people because they are sort of born as Class B citizens, then these persons will be much more vulnerable to become victims of trafficking. So, Maria Grazia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Teresa. Let me thank, first of all, it's a privilege to be here and participate in your General Assembly. About vulnerability, of course, there are many factors as Teresa said, there are personal factors, and we find this kind of constitutive elements of vulnerability in the personal history of different people. But we should be aware also of the fact that there are structural factors, both in countries of origin and in countries of destination. When we talk about vulnerability, we should be aware that, for example, concerning women, patriarchy is the main structural factor that shapes the life of women. And it is domestic violence, sexual violence, limited access to resources of any kind of resources, cultural, but also material resources, discrimination, lack of opportunities. I have heard so many times, speaking with the survivors, saying more or less this statement: there was nothing for me there. And this gives the sense of the feeling of destitution, of meaningless life. And this is a powerful motivation to leave, even in unsafe conditions. But we have to learn from this feeling that pushed people, because there is also a strength, something that can help when a person decides to recuperate their liberty, their freedom. And I come to the topic that I was asked to address more particularly: assistance. Maybe we made mistakes from, historically, I mean, because it is already 20 years that we are dealing with this problem. At the beginning, we made a mistake of problematization. In the sense that we thought that assistance, whatever kind of assistance, was much better than being trafficked, than being exploited. And we thought that maybe rescue the person and assist the person was enough. And this is the reason why I say we, but unfortunately, we were not in a position to decide anything. So states, governments, this is more precise, thought that this was the minimum standard that could be successfully implemented. But now we know that this does not work. I've seen so many people, so many girls, and you can understand this when you talk with them. They are ready to live again. They will do, because if this process, starting with the desire of going out from all this violence and exploitation, doesn't give any concrete results in terms of better opportunities to have a different life, the person actually is ready to live again, to try again. And we have to think about the fact that when we talk, this is the traditional language of legislation on trafficking, we talk about identification of trafficking victims and assistance. If we think about these two words, we understand that these two words imply a certain passive attitude of the person. It's not the person, you know, acting as the main character there. No, there is a police officer identifying the person, saying, yes, this is a victim, or no, this is not a victim. And then assistance. You are there and I give you counseling, everything okay, counseling is okay, healthcare is okay, but there is something missing. And I'm not talking about what is really bad, which is, for example, the fact that many governments deciding to give assistance, you know, by themselves through bureaucratic channels have, you know, put in place the so-called closed shelters, which means that people are more or less in detention. And you can imagine, after being trafficked, a person finds themselves in a situation of further violation of a fundamental right, as the right to, you know, freedom of movement. I'm not talking about the worst response. I'm talking about the standard response. And the standard response is something that we have to revise, I think substantially. And probably we have to go beyond this terminology of passivity and promote a shift toward agency and empowerment, which are, you know, the key words. Otherwise, we will have just a paternalistic approach, and you know, we will unintendedly reiterate the same patriarchal model that has caused so much trouble and suffering. So in my report, in my last report to the Human Rights Council, I talked about innovative and transformative models of social inclusion. Vabbè, l'ho preso ormai. Non avevo capito, scusami. So I talked about innovative and transformative models of social inclusion for survivors. Why innovative? As I said, because we have to think about something which is not, you know, shaped on the same gender roles, for example. How many experiences, you know, with very good intentions, reiterate the fact that a woman could be a cook, or could sew, or could do other traditionally women's works. In transformative, because this kind of support for victims should look at the future, should give the person further opportunities that she or he didn't have at the beginning of the story. And of course, this kind of transformative experiences are not so easy, not even to design, because of course everybody has prejudice or everybody has you know, ideas that is not easy to deconstruct. Because of course everybody has lived in a patriarchal society, but we have to think in terms of change, in terms of transformative activities based on education, for example, based on skill acquisition, and not necessarily the traditional skills. For example, when I was in Nigeria, I witnessed the fact that women were very keen to follow skill management, business skill acquisition that were organized not only for victims of trafficking, but for all returnees from Libya. And this is another suggestion I would like to give you. Activities, training activities, or in general terms, activities designed for trafficking victims shouldn't be segregating activities. Much better if they can be carried out in larger, broader communities, because one of the challenges hampering the possibility of survivors to achieve a real social inclusion is still stigma. And whatever can overcome this kind of stigma is instrumental to viable solutions that can design better and different opportunities for work, life in general terms, family reunification, etc. Are there successful experiences? A few. We have to say that this kind of innovative and transformative models are still in the making. Yes. But there are successful experiences, and importantly, these experiences are based, for example, on agency and self-organization. For example, in Nepal, there is a very interesting experience of domestic workers. Among them, some of them were trafficked. Domestic workers coming back to Nepal and deciding to build a cooperative company in which they put the money they have. Come si dice risparmiare?
They have put
aside to give loans to other domestic workers coming back and needing money to start an activity. And everything is based on mutual trust coming from the common experience of being exploited as domestic workers. Another experience here in Italy is the experience of the trade union of agricultural laborers, workers, promoting unionization and trying to achieve better working conditions, not necessarily through the the criminal law channel, but through the labor law channels and collective negotiation. So there are opportunities to revise and make our thinking more sophisticated in terms of problematization, knowing that vulnerability is there, is still there when people return or when people decide to undertake a process of freedom. Vulnerability is still there because the situations that the person try to escape doesn't finish with their decision to try something new, to leave their exploiters. And so we should be aware of the fact that whatever kind of support should be based on choices, on personal choices, on the real willing of the person concerned. There shouldn't be any decision coming from from the top, be it government or an NGO, because we are not, as NGOs, we are not immune from an approach that, for very good reasons, result in a paternalistic approach. So everything should be based on personal choices, and our support should be to build the material conditions for better opportunities. Thank you. And sorry for, for
I think it was a very good reflection. If you don't mind, I underlined a meaningless life. When people feel that their lives are without meaning. And this is so powerful. Thank you, Maria Grazia. And the patriarchal approach in assistance. When we assist individuals that are in need, we may perpetuate the differential of power which was at the very origin of their vulnerability. And I remember when I also was assisting victims of trafficking, this was my big dilemma when I was training social workers who worked in NGOs and in other environments where they would assist victims. And now my question to you, Helen, as an educator, how do you deal with the vulnerabilities of people that are hosted in the community of St. Joseph, which hosts many different people, not only victims of trafficking, also other people in need? So which is your experience, and what are the key messages that you would like to share with us?
Buonasera a tutti, parlo italiano.
I'm going to speak Italian today. I'm truly very happy to be able to express my opinion on the victims of human trafficking, because it is truly very easy to use these two words. You know, you define human trafficking. But who are the victims of such trafficking? They do exist because there is traffic. It does exist. It is truly difficult. It is really very difficult for them who live this. After a long journey, they abandon their hometown and they truly experience a very difficult moment. I live with them every day on a daily basis. You should see when they arrive. The moment they land, they're unable to sleep at night. I mean, you know, this is the most difficult moment. It's as if they see ghosts day and night. They live in truly difficult conditions. Who are these traffickers? Who are these people? Sometimes they're families, friends, acquaintances. Maybe even if they don't really necessarily, since they don't live together, you know, you are unaware that that person is a trafficker. When they come and we welcome them in our communities, the moment they arrive to us, I would like to inform my parents and let them know that I have arrived in Italy. I call I called my family, and then I talked to them, and at that moment I'm unable to sleep at night. The moment they finished a call with their parents, the parent immediately calls the trafficker and say, you know where she ended up? She ended in the welcome center, and the trafficker comes after them. They're also so they, even if they don't speak the language, they don't speak Italian, they know that they have to continue their trip. And we have to inevitably put a guard, a police. I lived exactly the same situation myself. I experienced it. And I truly thank God. It's a moment of I was rescued. I was saved by the St. Joseph's Institute. They helped me a lot. And now I'm very happy. I have my family, I have a husband, I have my children. We are working. But when I see them, the moment they arrive and they land, I don't want them to continue this trip to reach what they consider the final destination, because I know it's going to be more suffering for them. It's an endless suffering. It's often to speak about that. Words are important, but we have to help them. You know, some are even minors. The moment they become adults, or they reach adulthood, they have no choice, no future. What are they going to do at that point when they turn 18? At times I forget about my family back home, because you know, where I work, I don't have any family member. I'm always alone where I work. So I go to work at 8:30, and sometimes I return home at 6 p.m. in the afternoon. And I don't do that for money. Of course, the first months, the superior helped me, and she wanted to give me some extra money in my payroll. But I said, no, I don't want this extra money. I want to remain poor as I've been always. But we have to help these girls. We have to help these young. Thanks to God, we have been able to help a lot of girls, a lot of young girls. And when I return home late in the afternoon, I bring with me the thoughts and the concerns. What will happen tonight? Some maybe will try to run away. They're ready to destroy doors and windows, to leave. And they also ask me in the following morning, but why should we remain here? Why should we stay here? My mother, my young brothers, they're hungry. And you give me money that I should send to them? My mother, she needs to have money for the house, just like anybody else. Some mothers to basically see her daughter. She says, you are an educator. You know what I did? I want to call your mother and talk to her. Sometimes they don't believe that life is difficult out here. They believe that it's like an El Dorado. And I talk to them and I tell them the truth. And since we are truly aware of what is outside there, we don't want to let them go and let them become slaves. You know, the mothers back home are unaware. They believe that they have to just continue their journey and make a living because they do need money. Also for the girls, it's not easy. So when they hang up, when they finish speaking to their parents, they tell me, I want to go. I need to go. And I say, because, you know, the trafficker, we know what happens if they don't continue. They're going to go back home, going to the mother's house, hit the mother, burn the house, burn the home. And the mother is obliged to tell her daughter, please don't remain where you are, continue, go on. Because in Nigeria, from where I came, there's some towns where there's no power, no electricity, so they cannot watch the TV, they don't see the news, they're not informed, they don't see what happens when they arrive, they don't even know what happens in Libya, they don't see, and so they don't hear about anything. Somebody arrives and you say, I want to send my daughter to Europe, and they also see that they're going to have new dresses, work, but they don't know that the mother, in order to do that, first of all, you have to, yes, they do give you dresses, but they give you dresses to become a prostitute. That's why they dress you. But the mothers don't know. They don't know if they don't know, and they're maybe even not interested in knowing that the daughter might contract some illnesses and might be beaten and might suffer violence. I tried to speak with the mothers, and she said, you know, if you come back to Nigeria, I'm going to hit you. And I said, I can bring your daughter back, but I'm not going to leave your daughter go on the road. So a month or two later, the girl says, I would like to try again. Could I call my mother? And I want to talk to my brother and my younger sister and brother. The mother answers and say, are you still alive? A mother. It makes me shiver. It's truly an endless path and journey. And then one says, this is a joke? No, no joke. This is a reality. It's true life, daily life. I've been hit. You know, some of these girls came up in the morning and hit me because they say, you have to let me go. And she says, why do you want to save me? Why? Who is paying you for that? I say, nobody's paying for me. No, nobody's paying me. Do you want to be a slave? Yes, I do want to become a slave. But they don't even know what does means to become a slave. They say, I want to try, let me try. A girl arriving in Italy just a few days after. She doesn't even know where she ends up, you know? She doesn't even know the name of the street, the name of the city. First thing, for them the important thing is to arrive. Sometimes we bring them to school in the morning, we accompany them. When they finish school, we go and bring them back to community. So we go and fetch them. And I ask at the school, Where is the girl? Oh, she left. What do you mean she left? It's truly an endless work. Very tough, very difficult. For them, it's a nightmare. I can understand. When they hang up or they close the phone call, the first thing, they cry. They start crying for a whole day. Sometimes they ask me, can I call my family? And I say, no, because you don't have money in your mobile. You don't have credit, particularly on Saturday and Sunday. You have no credit in my, but can't I go and recharge my phone? The superior is out of the house. Can't you borrow me some money to charge my phone? Because we on Saturday and Sunday, we have to have a moment of a break, you know? Because as sisters, they're a bit more adults. So we, on Sunday, we take a break. We take shifts. But I can tell you for the girls, it's the most difficult moment of the week for us in the community. You try to give them whatever they ask, but they say, I'm not interested. The only thing they're interested is leaving. So they're minors and they remain in a community. As soon as they turn 18, what do these girls have to do? What can they do? How do they live? In our community, there is a law. When they're adults, they're 18, they have a right to leave. And we have tried to develop a lot of different activities and crafts. A bakery, a sewing shop, pottery shop. So they have a lot of workshops where they can learn these crafts. And so tomorrow, when they leave, or someday, they can try to work. But you know, they don't consider this sufficient. Because their goal is to basically go where they want to go. So what can we do? I tell you, it's really hard. It's really hard. Even a mother sometimes says, you're no longer my daughter if you don't choose. Either you go to the trafficker or you decide. So if you don't do that, and you're no longer my daughter, and they call me mommy, and I say, what do I answer to my mother when and to answer to her, yes, I don't want to be your mother, your daughter anymore. So what does it mean? I will never go back to Nigeria? Yes, stay here, remain here. Now the tutor, when she was a minor, now the tutor basically considers this girl as her daughter. So she brings her home on weekends, on holidays. The girl lives with the tutor. And so she basically acts as a mother. I tell you truly, it's not easy. It's not easy for the girls. It's not easy for anybody. You know what? Traffickers are free in all this. They have cars, beautiful villas, standard of living very high. They don't work. They just earn money. And the police, the police see them, Police officers stop them, but they have documents, regular documents. I think we need to intensify controls, catch them. So let's speak about Nigerian church in Italy. That's the most delicate part of the whole story. A priest, a missionary, doesn't reads the gospel. He doesn't really do any formation. He goes to the church. He said he reads the gospel. He opens the book and reads it. So he had no information, and so he pretends that he is a priest. And they say he's a pastor, but the pastor is not a true pastor. He's simply a masked trafficker. A girl, 17. She's in Italy. No parents. The pastor, you cannot ask him, where do you live? What are you doing? So what do you do? Put 50 euros as an alimony, as an offer? Yes, he's very happy. He earns money like that. So where is the full stop? I mean, where are we going to put a full stop in this whole situation? My husband tells me every day, one day or the other, you're going to fall sick with what you're living. Why don't you take a break? Don't think. And I say, 100 times when I arrive at home at midnight, I need to call my superior. Often, you know, sometimes the girls fight at night. The police comes, and then they call me, and my husband says, could you bring me to the community? I say, what time is it? Isn't it midnight? But tomorrow I'll have to work. But I have to go now. I have to go. Please, bring me. The police calls me, the superior. What are they saying? They're struggling. They're fighting. And then I remain there at the community till 3 a.m. And when the police leaves, I go back home. Let's go to sleep. We put them in separate rooms so they don't fight again. Pray, Hail Mary, asking them, pray, relax, so the superior as well can have a moment to sleep. Sometimes in my community, there are all the Nigerian men outside. Why are they outside of the door? You know what they're waiting? They're waiting for the girls to escape, to run out of the windows. And you have to be very careful, you know. You are helping. Does she truly want to be helped? Because one of the girls, after 2 years, she started working and collaborating with a trafficker. She went to the Penelope Association, said, I'm fed up. I want to change lifestyle. So these social centers called my community, and they said, we come to fetch this girl because this girl needs help, asks for help. She arrives, she has 2 phones. So they seize the 2 phones. So the trafficker cannot be called. We brought the 2 suitcases to the community. She calls me on one side and she tells me, I'm not going to leave these suitcases here. Go where you have to sleep. We prepared her bed, her dresses. But in the suitcase, there's something important I cannot leave here. And I say, what is there so precious in those suitcases? I have 3 phones. What do you mean, other 3 phones? They already seized 2. So what do you have, 5 phones, 5 cell phones? What are you doing with all these phones? One is to call my friend, one to call my family, one is my personal phone. But don't tell anybody, please. You know, we're Nigerian, the 2 of us. You don't have to say what we do. You don't have to say everything we are doing to the white. But I trust you. I'm telling you a bit my secrets. And I said to my superior, here there's something special. Be careful. Here we are in trouble. And he said, why? The girl is not, She's not a victim. She has a nice back, let's say so, nice back. So I go home. Every day when I arrive, I tell my colleagues, be aware of the girl, be careful. She's not an easy one. And the girl, they said, she succeeded in finding and taking a girl. She was pregnant, 6 months pregnant. She hid in a cupboard for 100 euros. And he said, you want to, 600 euros, sorry, not 100, 600 euros, because then you want to reach the trafficker to earn money. We've been helping and we keep helping this girl. And then at the end, she escaped. No, she basically left and 2 girls left with her, 200 euro, so 100 each. Now I said, what are we doing with this girl in the community? Fortunately, we went to the police station, we filed a claim, and we said, you know, not only we, of course, we denounced her, but also we denounced that she had 2 young girls escape. One was pregnant, 6 months pregnant. At 2 a.m., she ran away, and then the police came to the community. They did a search in the community. Unfortunately, they did not find. And they said, where did they go from? I mean, from which door or window? You know where? In the end, they found her in the cupboard. So finally, they opened the cupboard in the room, and she was hidden in the cupboard. I'm sorry if I was a bit long, but it's terrible.
Okay, I would listen to her stories, to the real life forever. But we have a last guest, and I would like to give him the floor before we have then a break and reflect on the questions that we are going to pose after 3:30. I know we are late, but Carlos, how many dilemmas Helen's story brought up? Sure, the dilemmas of assistance. Assistance can be worse than being exploited. And she just told us how the life in a shelter can be. I remember survivors were fighting one against the other in order to watch a TV program. Who is going to watch which? Who is going to decide which TV program is going to be watched? Huge fights. Assistance can be worse than exploitation because we are longing for a meaningful life. What makes a life meaningful? Sewing, the machine, cooking, the usual women works, the usual me and you, as Maria Grazia was saying, I am the helper, you are the assisted. But how can we really fight against the trafficking if traffickers, and I quote Helen, do not work but earn much more than those who work? Fancy, isn't it? They have documents. They go around white collars. Oh, they go around in big cars and they show their power through the big earnings. They don't need to hide. Victims have to hide. Social workers, you have to hide because you are close to the victims and they are free. This is a bit unequal, isn't it, Carlos? I know UNODC doesn't have all the answers, but maybe there is a bit more need of a bit more criminal justice approach, maybe just a bit. So please help us understanding better how we can fight traffickers as well. Thank you.
Yo quisiera reconocer
I would like to acknowledge that human reality often is facing us with challenges. And this is often what states, what governments speak about in the large gatherings. And now, listening to your words, to the words of Helen, also recognizing your courage and your energy. So maybe this would probably need to have a bit of an analysis of all the initiatives that they're producing, you know, handbooks, guides, and this is what my agency, the UNODC, are doing as a secretary. So in our convention against organized crime. Now I would like to, let's leave all these guides, books, documents, reports of working groups, which are all in Vienna, a wonderful library that you can consult because it's all available online. But allow me maybe just to go a little bit beyond all these analysis. Because thinking about also the challenges of criminal law, and this is also from my formation training as a legal expert, as a lawyer. I certainly believe that one of the challenges of criminal justice is to regain the symbolic power that judicial cases can offer. Because in our work as United Nations agencies, in working together with judges, prosecutors and lawyers, it's very easy to comply with the rule, with international law. But going beyond legal instruments, when you basically make a decision, and a decision is not only for all types of crime, we forget about the transformation power that sentence, that decision can produce on civil society in that given country. So now, of course, looking at the work that you as religious organizations and as consecrated, I'm witnessing and testifying to the excellent work which has been done in Latin America, and they often provide a very strategic debate, because the decision of a court can truly transform the reality, and it can become a precedent, it can become a model. The words which are used in a legal document, that is a decision, can also be used by social society organizations to promote changes. I know these changes are not easy, but they do start. So if we go back to the symbolic value of justice, of concrete cases, I think that this is certainly one of the important challenges for the future, and we as United Nations can provide support. To that, I would like to add, in somehow, how could I say, clearing the way to some kind of myth. There's always a myth, you know, which is the true profile of the victim and the profile of the trafficker. And when you speak about these profiles, you end up by not including all situations, because often we tend to follow the guidelines, these protocols and handbooks. And this is what we were saying this morning in our language group, in our group. we should try to have specific readings of given context. When you say the human trafficking can do A, B plus C, not necessarily in a very rational order. It can also be C and A, so it can happen in very standard situations or even in different places. So this morning what we were saying is that there is no precise age. There's no real, age or given age. We have to also clear the way to the myth of different sexes. And when often now, you often have more women in the among police officers, judges, and attorneys and prosecutors. So the presence of women is broadening up also the prospects and the impact of justice. And one of the important recommendations as well, which has been analyzed and elaborated by the United Nations, is how can we promote ever more our activity through the networks. These networks do represent an element of transformation, and truly, in particular, in the field of justice. And allow me to explain better. When we speak about authorities, what has been promoted is networking. Networking is not something new, because in the case of Latin America, we have now truly a network of prosecutors acting against human trafficking. But now, in developing these networks of prosecutors, they discovered that there was another network of police officers. But for some reason, the two networks never were talking to each other. There was no kind of a partnership. While instead now they're invited to share information, to collaborate and be partners. So coordination is another challenge in criminal justice. How can we try to better dialogue? How can we better exchange views on these different levels of action of justice so that we can progress and also remain not only connected, but also to be united. This morning when we saw that wonderful heart together, that word together is also one of the goals of criminal justice. So it is not sufficient to have the data of the mobile phone, his email of the prosecutor, and simply have a list of phones and instead have true coordination between prosecutors. Now, I had a number of recommendations of data, but since, as it has been said before, these experiences, first-hand experiences, I don't think that data become meaningful. So I would like to maybe go beyond and just consider justice. How can justice transform societies? How can we allow these international laws, which are thought and conceived in New York, in Vienna, how can they be converted daily in your field activity? You who are side by side to the victims and the survivors.
Merci. Oui. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'm going to conclude in French before the break. The key word is transformation. Transformation. Transformation in interpersonal relationships. Transformation in prevention. Transformation in criminal justice. I would see this as the key word. Now I would like to invite you to have a coffee break, and we are going to reconvene in 15 minutes. to ask questions to our panelists and maybe to continue reflecting on these three pillars or three lines of action. Thank you. And the word transformation. They are here representing. Now, in the conclusions and in your work, we would like to invite you to reflect on a challenge that you are going to write and send to the coordination team, because the coordination team is going to collect your requests. I know that there are many challenges. We are well aware of that. But the work is to truly focus and identify one of the main challenges that you believe is more important for your future work. So I give you 10 minutes. 10 minutes to choose or think about a question, identifying the main or most important challenge, which you consider more relevant for your congregation and for your future work.
Merci. Alors, je vais maintenant
I'm now going to collect the questions that each table has prepared. I'd like to start going around at that table. So we were not able really to prepare the question. We had a question which has to do with two levels. One level regards vulnerability. Vulnerability is viewed as a true challenge in the networks, particularly those of Latin America. So how can we limit and reduce such a strong the vulnerability which is due to inequality, gender issues, patriarchy, etc., etc. So what can we do, we as network? What can we do? In which way can we contribute to make, to reduce, to limit this vulnerability, in order to then also, as a consequence, reduce human trafficking? I don't know if I expressed that correctly, she says.
Following table to formulate their question.
We were talking about prevention quite a lot, and how young women tend to go back even after they have been helped to come out of the trafficking situation. So the question we formulated is, would you please explain clearly the transformative model or the transformative way of preventing human trafficking? And in the course of the rehabilitation, the sister just added as well. So it's the transformative model of preventing and also of rehabilitation.
Thank you so much. Je voudrais la table après.
The following table, could they formulate their question?
English, French, Spanish.
This is unformed. We had an overarching statement that patriarchy has controlled the writing of law and the lack of implementation of law. And therefore the challenge could be to Talitha Kum to initiate research about the law, the gaps, the absence of prosecution, to enable revision of the law that is based on the education of the judiciary to enable prosecution to be a strong deterrent.
Thank you so much. As a lawyer, I love what you are proposing to do. Just a very personal comment. La table encore plus loin.
The table further down. I guess it's French, isn't it? So we propose as a challenge, after having heard the various panelists, or even after the presentations of each continent, we should maybe try to make our efforts mutual. These are women who have worked with victims and have done something very useful for their lives. And so maybe starting from, for example, 3 projects, we could maybe establish an international center of creativity, of Talitha Kum, starting from our local agencies. So leaving this assembly with a concrete project which would allow us to help population where we are active. So there's another table to the right. You. Our conversation had to do with these sort of shelters. In these shelters where you welcome, how can you make life meaningful? Since the current model is the model which has been proposed, which are the possible guidelines? In terms of lifestyle, of meaningful lifestyle. We were just asking ourselves. We speak about these centers where you welcome. We have this meaning. We have a meaningless life. They arrive with a meaningless life, and how can we convert that into a meaningful life? So, in these communities, in these shelters, in these houses, probably the models that we are proposing should be questioned. So, how can we propose a different lifestyle? What about the other one? Table to the right.
Needed more time, but our 2 questions are: how can Talitha Kum be more visible and active in our countries and local churches to more urgently address the root causes and effects of human trafficking and convince people of the urgency of the situation. Our second question, how can we give information to those who are vulnerable to being trafficked?
So, if I understand well, it's public awareness. How can we increase public awareness about trafficking, and how can we inform potential persons at risk to prevent them to become victims of trafficking? Did I understand well?
It was more than just public awareness. It touched on a variety of issues that are part of the root causes and effects of human trafficking and the urgency of this situation in our world today.
Thank you. La table à côté, je crois, non, it's English speaking, if I understand well, again.
After our discussion in our group, we have this question for UN. We have focused on the vulnerable as supply for several years. What are the strategies the UN is using or could use to address demand?
To address demand. Only to UN? Poor UN. Aquí hablamos español.
What language are you speaking here? English.
Okay.
Given the largeness or the vastness of the problem of human trafficking, the networks that we have are not strong enough to address this gigantic problem. So how can we in our countries or in our continent strengthen this network and bring awareness among the consecrated people or the church personnel to understand the seriousness of this problem, so that we forget our individuality and our own plans and come together to address this problem together as church personnel?
Okay. Thank you. La table ici, s'il vous plaît.
First table here in the center. So our question has to do with connection towards transformation. So how can we allow the protocol in Palermo, signed in Palermo, connected with reality in the field? Means are available, but they're not easy to be implemented because of corruption, because due to a lack of formation, proper formation, coordination, or agreement, consensus. Thank you. The following table in the middle. Behind. After having listened, we understood that we would like to go back to the structural issues, patriarchy as religious life, consecrated life. We believe that it is very important if we don't question, if we don't put into question our way of connecting to each other, to accompany, to relate each other. How can we provide an answer which is something new, which can bring about transformation? How can we do all that if we don't truly, we are deciding for the other person. We are making decisions for them. This is what we are doing. We are before this situation, and this is the approach we always use. It's almost as if we impose a different relationship which is very imbalanced. So if they're already living inequalities, how can we provide an answer which brings about transformation? Are we simply repeating old patterns? So we do have to accompany our victims, but we need to be formed. Goodwill is not sufficient. We don't even have a magic stick, but we need to be formed and informed to act. Not only, but our way of being, about our sexuality. We have a lot of assumptions and false ideas. How can we accompany a woman, a girl, a young girl, if we have a lot of stereotypes in our mind? This is not going to help us in our work. It's going to bind us. Or even the idea of a God punishing a person who has suffered terrible experiences. So we have to drill down into these very deep issues and be able to bring a transforming action.
The last
Our question is about protection of the survivors of trafficking. We are interested the Helen sharing about the shelter is also for us is questioning our services of shelter human trafficking. How we can do differently to protect the survivors of human trafficking, because we have to consider also the care of the caregiver. Can you more elaborate the approach of innovative and transformative model for social inclusion for the survivors of human trafficking? And I add more about the important, because is Talitha Kum is have the big power in terms of systemic change. So we have a lot of documentation, and that we can see and witness also in our experience. And this is can bring systemic change, how we can really work on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for all the contributions. I will try now to cluster a bit the questions, because some of them, they relate very much to issues that are close, interconnected to each other. And then I will give the floor to each one of the presenters to reply to the questions. So, in particular, regarding systemic change, innovative, transformative models of assistance and protection of victims of trafficking. This is, on the one side, an issue of secondary prevention, which means how do we prevent survivors to be re-trafficked, to enter again in the cycle of exploitation. And it's also a primary prevention effort. How do we address in a creative and transformative ways, how can we prevent people to get trafficked in a first instance? So one of the tables was providing the example of establishing a center for education and creativity. Some others were also relating to the fact that in order to be transformative in the forms of assistance, we need to transform ourselves inside in terms of establishing different, a different type of interpersonal relations. So there are issues that are interconnected in terms of training the caregivers, taking care of caring for the caregivers, and also exploring innovative models. So I would like each one of you to give a brief answer Of course, your questions are immense. You are posing big questions, but I will ask each panelist to give a precise and straightforward answer as much as possible. I would like to start from Carlos to Helen, and I will give you the microphone, Carlos. Thank you.
Hola. Okay.
It's a bit stressed. I feel that there are more questions put together and several challenges. I'll try to answer to all of them in a concise fashion, but I first of all would like to state that the United Nations also agrees on the importance of having this form of transformative action. So trying to break this network of traffickers, but also to break it in changing the practices that we've been advocating during many years. There's a very famous statement which stipulates there are no more clarity and fullness other than the person who keeps doing exactly the same in the same way, hoping to have a different result, which is impossible, as we can imagine. So what we have to now do is truly completely change our mindset. We have to completely change the way we act. We daily work with prosecutors, police officers, and judges, and we have already started some time ago to change a bit our way of working and mindset, but also trying to promote maybe partnerships with the private sector. How can technology contribute in breaking these networks of traffickers? I believe technology can certainly be supportive in also collecting evidence. And then how can we work with universities, academies, formation centers, and institutes, trying truly to move out from a bit of a standard preconceived way of acting and thinking. So just to give you an example, recently our agency has launched some competences. They call them hackathons. It's like a brainstorming session. So it's 2 days during which, as the word says, there's a brainstorming. They sort of put on the table different possibility and solutions. So if you're working with lawyers and judges and prosecutors, you feel a bit lost at the beginning, but then these brainstorming sessions can be extremely fruitful. So this is always to renovate, to identify transformative models. So the fact of opening up and inviting other stakeholders, other, let's say, protagonists, can bring us to this result. Now, what can we do to overcome vulnerability? Well, this morning we truly were discussing about that. Certainly, the network has a great potential, particularly in terms of information. So how can we provide greater information for those who are vulnerable? How can we prevent and avoid that they might fall in the trap? Also, solve vulnerability. Well, this could be a more structural question, and it certainly maybe goes far beyond the scope of our action here today. But trying to limit abuse is probably a field in which we can join forces, although it might be a repetition, but a person who is informed can limit and the risks of falling into these networks. So both the place of origin, of transit or destination, we should try to make sure that proper information reaches all these people, and this can be very useful. Now, the question is to limit or reduce demand. Well, this is a challenge also for the United Nations, because all the measures which can be implemented are welcome. The idea also to criminalize the customer or the situation of exploitation is a decision which, of course, is in the hands of governments. So we always had to have a stand of neutrality, but the United Nations always contributes. All the measures, be them legal, administrative, of information, campaigns, to somehow limit the use of this kind of abuse are welcome. Now, education, coming to education. I think that in the field of forming the various legal authorities, one of the instruments we have tried to promote is the peer-to-peer formation. We felt that in this kind of formation we do obtain results, because judges can, together with other judges or other prosecutors with other prosecutors, together, this peer-to-peer, as speakers say, we are able to produce changes. This is about it. I also agree. Take care of the caregiver. I think is also of great importance, because quite often organizations don't take into account this in their plan of action. And also international organizations sometimes overlook the importance of caregivers, but we in the future will have to better take care of this aspect. And one last, with respect to the protocol of Palermo, how can we bring this into reality? Now, in terms of criminal justice, we are ever more working with authorities to make sure that the provisions of the protocol of Palermo are used in concrete cases, so recommendations, debates, become concrete cases. It doesn't have to remain like a nice book on the bookshelf, but rather, or in an office, but a prosecutor can certainly quote to the protocol, and the judge as well should use the document, hoping that these provisions may be used more frequently. Last year, there was a revision proposed and approved of this protocol. This will certainly be a challenge, because the concepts of the protocol are not that clear. So probably we should probably be more precise to better understand this phenomenon.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to keep it very brief, because I just looked at the question of vulnerabilities and reducing vulnerabilities. I wanted to share briefly, I had the great privilege of working and living in a dwelling centre for women who had been trafficked in the Philippines. And I certainly encountered wonderful workers there who were putting their heart and soul into the work of anti-trafficking. And I remember when I told them that I had the possibility of undertaking some research, I asked them, what do you need? What would be helpful for you? in undertaking research. And they said, we want to know how we can best provide a service that is going to transform the lives of these women. And for me, that was a very powerful indicator of the intentions of sisters in this instance and their co-workers to really want to make sure that they were doing best practice. And I think one of the things that we can learn within the Trafficking network is how to share those best practices and learnings, because there have also been some learnings along the way, particularly in relation to the whole issue of re-trafficking. One of the other things, one of the insights that I gained over that period of time and over the last 10 years is that recovery and transformation is a very time-consuming and expensive project. No one, I think Helen would agree with this, no one can recover overnight. For many, it's a lifelong process. I'm not a survivor, so I can't speak from a survival point of view. But I think we know, as practitioners and advocates, that the road to recovery is a long one. And if we spend as much, if governments spend as much money and time on prevention as they do recovery, they would probably find that it would be a lot less taxing. Now, I hate to talk in economic terms, but that's the reality. Is that recovery is a long process, and for many of the women that I've met, they have to be educated, even in a very basic level of education. They haven't had the opportunity to be educated beyond middle primary school for some people. To have psychosexual education and healthcare. This is a long process. And for those who are in there for the hard yakka in terms of working with, absolutely it can be hard to see long-term results. So I have no answers other than I think we do it well as religious women. I think we also have heaps of learnings amongst us. And I think often people are, women, religious and religious in general, are doing anti-trafficking work that they don't call anti-trafficking work. So they're doing work that is preventing people from being trafficked by connecting them to community, educating, ensuring safe environments. So I think we don't often enough congratulate ourselves.
Your questions are really difficult questions, about really the essential on trafficking and how to reduce vulnerability. To this question, but a few things I would like to say concerning migration. Migration policies worldwide are a big part of the problem because there are no or very, very limited regular many governments worldwide are trying to go for at least dramatically reduce the flows. And when we think about the motivations of people fleeing conflict, wars, political persecutions, famine, caused by the extreme poverty. Yes, the motivations are the idea of migration flows is
was xenophobic. But it's also an inclusion. So, of course, it is a lost opportunity to think about intelligent migration policies that can take advantage of migration as a everything against migrants, against foreigners, against minorities, without any real want to say that migration is fall in this dehumanization that we have seen, unfortunately, very recently in the Mediterranean. We see the boats rolling, we see the people dying. So this duties fight for change in this big policy. And of course, in this context, anti-trafficking policies can be much more successful in general terms. Because of course, if we implement anti-trafficking policies in a context of restrictive migration policies, of course, the decision to allow persons to stay is made on the basis of an exception approach, which leads to a restrictive, a very narrow So this is one of the issues, and of course the other issue is to change ourselves, to change the cultural environment, especially concerning gender. When we think about, and I go to another cluster, when we think about a meaningful life, we also consider meaningful life as not. I don't go to the personal. If we think about concrete practices with I see that one aspect of this meaningful approach to support and protection is based on real relationships between and being very, very rebuilding something that has been destroyed during the exploitation, during the trafficking process, during severe exploitation, that was deep trauma. A relationship with another woman, a different relationship, needs to do against the possibility to trust, to believe that another human being can have a real interest in you, and it's not like another not to exploit taking advantage of your vulnerability. And for a person, for a public person, belief is very difficult. It's a process. It's one part of the recovery process. And the other thing about a meaningful approach to this difficult space is about, especially concerning people is a approach to the future. Everybody needs to have an idea of what the future can be. And the idea that when you do something today to build the future, and again, that's very even to think that the future is possible. So there must be something that can manage now, today, to build something for the future. And what is that? What are these transformative models? Of course, it is discussing with your daughter about
that of course this is a big issue because this implies a big offer, formative, a big big offer in terms of education, in terms of training, etc. Of course, the offer cannot be immense, but it could be sufficiently differentiated to meet the attitude and aspirations of different persons. Something that I would like to share with you is a practice in India. This project is called Free a Girl, and the project consists of helping also financially a girl to resume the formal education at the university. And in this case, these girls wanted to be lawyers, to help others to achieve remedies and reparations. And of course, this can be an opportunity because we have to think that the life of these girls have been broken. At a certain moment, they were obliged to leave whatever was their life before. So we have to think that in certain situations, we have to rebuild the possibility for them to continue their formal education. In some cases, they are completely illiterate. And of course, alphabetization is always a starting point. But we have to think also about the fact that people want to undertake new experiences. Something that works very well is digital technology training. This is something that young people like, that can, of course, intercept certain areas of the market, but of course also I don't want to be biased myself about traditional professions and types of work, because it is also true that even a traditional work, sewing or doing come si dice, design and all this can be successful if the training is a quality training, and if there is a network in which this product can be valued, can be commercialized, can be publicized. And again, I think that from this point of view, it is important, the first phase, the discussion about what a choice can be and what can motivate a choice. And of course, the transformative aspect of, and I finish here, the transformative aspect is about what I can think about my future and what I can do to realize that. And Talita Kum, from this point of view, offers a great opportunity because it is a big network. And when I think about, personal choices and the possibility to offer adequate, appropriate education and training opportunities, we can think that this can be done in this big network. So we can, with the creative work, with the, different kind of formative and training offer, we can also, through the network, respond positively to different expectations. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Grazia. I will skip my contribution. I will go to Helen, and I will speak in Italian now. Helen, dacci alcuni elementi.
Could you give us a few, Helen, a few hints, a few elements which can answer to the question of the sisters in terms of assistance in an innovative form of care? How can we go a bit beyond the limits of your experience also has shown that are not always appropriate? How can we basically break this sort of standard way of acting? If we want to help all the victims, Talita Kum could do something better for everybody, because we are following this path to be better people and help them face their difficulties. So I don't know if it could be possible to set up a network of working groups. Some of these victims suffer. When they arrive, they are minors, but when they travel, they were told that they were 20 years old. But when if they want to study, they are struggling. If you are 20 years old, it's difficult to start primary or they start the beginning of secondary school. So even if you're an adult, you can study, you can go to school. But if we could maybe within this international network, if we could establish and create something for them, when we welcome them and when one needs to work, we could sort of use the network for that. We could provide them or offer something.
Summarize, if you allow me, in few words, and I will add a couple of keywords that I didn't hear from the other panelists. First, participation. If we want really to be transformative, we need victims to participate because they transform us. They do. In anything that we do, including education paths. I'll give you an example of when I was working in Morocco with unaccompanied minors. We carried out a research on their motivations, on the drivers, thinking that they wanted to migrate in order to gain fast money. But we discovered that, on the contrary, they wanted to participate in the life of their community. They wanted to be considered persons in the community. They wanted to be meaningfully engaged in cultural activities in the village. They wanted to be heard, listened to. They wanted to go to school and to and their views be considered. So they wanted to be the protagonists of their lives. They wanted to be listened. So it was nothing to do with purely economic opportunities. People want to participate. Individuals want to drive their lives. And of course, it can be difficult, but it's doing it together that can be really transformative. And in this, the relationship, we change ourselves in order to change the outside, as Maria Grazia was saying, as Angela was underlining, is a part of this path of transformation. Then decent work for everyone. We don't need any kind of job. We need decent work in countries of origin and countries of destination. And it's in both countries as difficult as for everyone. I mean, we were discussing with one of you, how can we offer former victims of trafficking to work in a hotel or in a family for €6 per hour? We bring them out from a form of exploitation and we are the ones to put them in another situation of exploitation. It's not real exploitation, but it's not decent work. And this is where innovation can bring something. Innovation, digitalization, digital education. There is an NGO, a small NGO in the north of Italy, in Milan, where Egyptian unaccompanied minors are involved in digital laboratories, in coding, inventing apps. And it's true that when you are illiterate, it's hard to go back to school, but we don't need to necessarily go through the usual traditional path. First elementary, second, third, fourth grade. So again, in order to think out of the box, as Carlos was mentioning, we need to open up to different experiences, different partners. And the real strength of this network is that it's so spread out that you can exchange and open up your different experiences. We would allow to open new perspectives. In these days, I'm dealing not only with good migration governance, which is a big challenge to convince governments to be less restrictive in their migration policies, which is one of the main challenges today. But also, and I'm asking, in doing so, I'm asking the contribution of innovative social enterprises. So I would like really to invite you to look at different experiences, look at different actors, look at different partners that were not considered up to now. So innovation is another key word that I would like to give you, gathering also the contributions of the other. Another word which was not mentioned is corruption. Good governance is one of the contributing factors, the structural one. And we can definitely mobilize public opinion against corruptive practices. And corruptive practices are not only in the countries of origin, they are very much also in the countries of destination, including in the so-called world of good ones, the NGOs. How many NGOs, they used European funds in a different way than the initial purposes. The reception and assistance of migrants is a business also for the civil society. And there are some occasions in which civil society is not transparent in using the funds that should be used for the proper assistance of people. transformative relationship, anti-corruption measure, innovation, decent work for everyone, quality education for all, and the big strength, which is the hope that Talitha Kum can really infuse in the survivors. You are religious people. Hope is your business. This is your real strength. I hope that this discussion this afternoon triggered some good ideas and some possible new perspectives for your daily work. I'm sure that in the coming days, you will continue reflecting, and I hope that you can consider the respective organizations and individuals who participated in this panel this afternoon as potential partners, and for sure, individuals with whom you can continue our joint reflections. With this, I would like to close and give Gabriella the floor for some closing words.
Yes, I knew. The magic man. Thank you, Carlos. Only to say that at 5:30 we have the bus to the US Embassy, to the residence of the ambassador of US to the Holy See. So some of you still confirmed, you are invited, but you are not obliged to go. So feel free, yes. No, I know, because the time framework is quite, but I would like to invite, first of all, to thank you. I think that it's a very important and good, so we can express our gratitude. Thank you. We have also